Yeah.
Terrific. Well, it's great to be speaking with you all tonight. Particular thank you to, of course, the JHSE and to Michael for inviting me. I know this organisation has done a huge amount over the past year to keep the community and sort of its members entertained as we've had this sort of strange period in our lives when we've all been stuck at home. So it's really terrific to be part of the programme. As most of you probably know, I was meant to give this talk in February, but unfortunately my grandmother died about a week before I was due to give this talk. And as you know, so many people all over the world, and I'm sure people in this call will know, not being able to sort of say goodbye or attend a funeral just means that it takes a bit of extra time really to come to terms with the loss and the reality of it. So I'm hugely grateful that it was able to be rescheduled for tonight. So of course, grateful for those who originally signed up for the February meeting and who have joined once again for this one. Just before I get into the kind of details of the story, I just want to say how I became interested really in my grandfather's story, which was very much both my grandmother and my grandfather's story, because they were both so involved in it and with kind of the success of my grandfather's political career and what he managed to do. As some of you might know, when you grow up with someone who is well known or famous, or in the kind of public eye in your family, you don't really grow up thinking of them as a famous person. You sort of just think of them however they happen to be the relation in your family. So in my case, it was just my grandpa Harry. And only as I sort of began to get into my teenage years did I kind of really begin to appreciate his wider significance. And my dad started to tell me kind of stories about what he did. And so naturally, I started to kind of try to do my best to research more about this, but I couldn't really find any specific place where I could kind of find all the information about what he did. I mean, he never really published a book, wasn't too interested after his political career ended in kind of self-promotion. So that really kind of just enticed me further into finding out, really what happened. And, that really led me to, as Michael mentioned, in 2019, spending the year in South Africa, basically going through my grandfather's papers and his archive, and just kind of looking at the raw source material to try to research, hopefully towards towards publishing a book. Of course, the pandemic has been a little bit disruptive for that, but it's still something I'm working towards. Okay, so who was Harry Schwarz? So when thinking about someone's life, obviously the beginning seems like an obvious place to start. But I think particularly in his case, it had his upbringing and his childhood and the experiences he had such a profound impact on, the things that he stood for and the decisions that he made in his life, and really the way that he thought other people should be treated. And so the story begins in a way that's quite similar to, I'm sure, many of your own families, and that's the story of a penniless refugee. So he was born in May 1924 in the Weimar Republic in Cologne, into a non-religious but sort of traditional Ashkenazi family, and he was given the name Heinz. And I'll tell you a little bit later on about how that became Harry. I'm sure you have a few guesses, but I'll let you know a little bit later on how that became the case. He was the oldest of two brothers. His younger brother Kurt eventually became a esteemed doctor and a professor, and today lives with his wife Elsa, not too far from where I am in London. I'm really pleased to say that they are both tuning in tonight. The family had very little money and went through a lot of sort of destitution following the Wall Street crash in the 1920s. That had a huge impact on them, but they had just about enough to get by. They were really a family of proud Germans. And I think it's important to say, because I think so many Jewish Germans in the 1920s and 30s really considered themselves as German as anyone else. His father Fritz and his grandfather Simon had both fought and been injured in the First World War, and his uncle had been actually killed tragically in the last days of the war. And as the National Socialists, or the Nazis, rose during the 1920s and 30s, his father Fritz, who was a salesman, began to get politically involved as a social democratic activist and an anti-Nazi campaigner. But on the eve of Hitler's election victory in March 1933, a few of his friends from the local Cologne police department came to his house and told him that essentially that the Nazi party were getting ready to round up political activists, pretty much as soon as the election was over, and that his name was on the list of people who was meant to be rounded up. So that night, his father Fritz fled to Switzerland. He wasn't granted any residency there, so he applied for immigration in France, Belgium, the UK, and the United States, and South Africa. And South Africa was really the only country that actually accepted his admittance. Obviously, looking back on what we know now in terms of the occupation of Europe, I think it's probably in hindsight, obviously a good thing that he wasn't allowed into France or Belgium, as he would have remained there possibly during the occupation. But for safety reasons, my grandfather and his brother Kurt weren't told where their father went. And when the Nazis came looking for him at his house, his mother Alma just said to them that he had abandoned them, essentially, because not wanting to give anything away. But as the Nazis kind of solidified their grip on power, and they were building the Third Reich, my grandfather became subject to, of course, their racial restrictions, and had such strong memories of being subject to those that segregation. He had to move school into a special Jewish school, and he was also thrown off public transport, of course, for just being Jewish. And those memories of segregation in the kind of South African context had such an important impact for what he thought was right, and really, as I say, shaped his values in the world. So as life eventually became unbearable for the family in Germany, his father had moved to Cape Town from Switzerland. It was decided the family in 1934 were also going to move to Cape Town. So they really left with nothing, only the clothes on their back essentially, and had to borrow the money from family basically to get money to go from Germany to Switzerland. And even though they left Germany, they still found that actually there was a huge amount of anti-Semitism in sort of white South African culture. He didn't speak any English or Afrikaans at first, and actually was involved in various fights at school, people basically picking on him for anti-Semitism, for being different. But despite that experience, throughout his whole life, he felt a huge sense of debt and gratitude towards South Africa for accepting him and his family. And he later wrote, whatever our hardships, and there were many to be recorded, we were among the fortunate. We as individuals escaped the extermination during the Holocaust, and we found a home in South Africa. Whatever the problems were of this country, it gave us shelter and opportunity, and above all, it gave us life. In 1938, it was decided that his maternal grandparents were going to come from join them in Germany, and basically there was a huge amount of growing nationalism and fascism in South Africa in the 1930s, in a similar way as there was sort of all over the world, really. But in South Africa, it manifested in sort of Afrikaner nationalism, which grew out of anti-British sentiment following the Second Boer War, excuse me, at the turn of the 19th century. And this created a huge amount of tension within South Africa between Afrikaner nationalists who basically wanted to close off the country to Jewish immigration. And that led the government essentially to introducing legislation in the 1930s to basically end all Jewish immigration. But there was one final ship, the SS Stuttgart, that basically brought 500 Jews from Europe to South Africa, and his grandparents were on them. Was on the ship. So he went down to the dock in Cape Town to greet his grandparents, but also waiting there was someone called Dr. Henrik Verwoerd, who was leading a group of nationalist Afrikaners who basically were holding up swastikas and signs saying "Jews go home." And this had such a huge impact on my grandfather that this was the welcome that he gave his grandparents. And, you sort of really have to feel for elderly people, leaving Germany and coming to what was meant to be their sanctuary and actually seeing swastikas on your arrival. But Hendrik Wits eventually actually became the architect of apartheid and the prime minister in South Africa. So I think for him, what later became his struggle against the National Party and apartheid was actually very personal, because the person who was leading the whole project of apartheid was actually the person who was actually telling his grandparents to go home as they arrived as refugees. The Second World War broke out, but he graduated from school from the highest marks in the year in 1942, and he was offered a scholarship at Rhodes University, but actually decided that he was going to join the South African Air Force to join the war effort. I've always thought that's such an extraordinary thing to do, having escaped, Europe, lucky to get out, to actually, as someone who came from poverty, to kind of put wealth and success to one side and to say, well, actually, I think it's more important that I join the military to kind of fight, those who were, after my family. I've always thought that was an extraordinary thing to do. So he signed up for the South African Air Force and became a navigator, and saw action over Libya, Egypt, and Crete. But this is really where he became Harry rather than Heinz. When he met his commanding officer for the first time, his commanding officer said to him, if you get shot down, they will know you are German and they will kill you. Your name is now Harry. Get a new set of dog tags made. So that's exactly what he did. So he just became known as Harry, and Heinz became his middle name from that point. There's a huge amount I could say about his time in the Second World War. I could probably give a whole separate talk on that, but I just want to read out a quite an exciting excerpt from his logbook on a mission from 1st of June 1944. So we were briefed that there was a German supply convoy north of Crete in the Aegean Sea. We had to attack the ship. All went well until we got near the convoy. The squadron did a run over the ships, but the ships were escorted by German fighter planes and they attacked. 6 aircraft in close formation had considerable firepower when focused on an attacking fighter plane and were left behind. And we were too slow to keep up with the box which we were part. I was sick. We kept on course and I aimed and dropped our bombs and we hit the larger ship with one of our 500-pound bombs. We saw the hit and it resulted in a feeling of exhilaration. I had done my job. It was my first blow against Hitler. It was my war, and as far as I was concerned, I was winning. Needless to say, a somewhat exaggerated feeling about one bomb hitting a ship a long way away from Berlin. But again, I think that excerpt just shows how personal this struggle was for him. After the war, he joined the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg with the help of an ex-serviceman's loan, and he's also secured work to train as a lawyer at the same time. This is his university class, and on the right, just below the X, you'll see him in his late 20s, but on the left, you will see a young man just below the X, Nelson Mandela, which is where he first met him for the first in the first time. He also met a few other people that became leading figures in in what became the anti-apartheid struggle, such as Joe Slovo, who was a Jewish communist leader. He graduated in 1947, but ahead of there was an election planned for 1948. He began to be incredibly worried about the chances of the Afrikaner Nationalist Party, who had supported the Nazis during the war. He feared they would win essentially over the governing National Party, over the governing United Party, which was led by a wartime leader, Jan Smuts. So he began to get involved in the United Party and was involved in the campaign. And you can see him with Jan Smuts in this photo. The election results in the election was 49% to the United Party and 37% to the National Party. But because they had a first past the post electoral system that was modelled what we still have here in the UK, the result was distorted because of the way the constituencies are based. That actually resulted in a National Party majority, which again I think is a real tragedy of history, that actually most people didn't vote for the apartheid policies of the National Party. I remember so clearly, my grandfather saying to me that he was physically sick on the night when he found out that the National Party had won, because for him, these were the people who had supported everything he stood against and sort of had openly Nazi contacts. And so it was very, very personal for him, both from a kind of ideological perspective, but also from a personal perspective as well. So it became much more active in the United Party after that. He was determined to reverse this result, which he sort of considered an accident of history. And so you can see this photo of him and Jan Smuts. Jan Smuts actually died a few days after this photo was taken. And my grandfather later told that this was actually the last photo ever taken of Jan Smuts, which is quite extraordinary. But as the National Party began to kind of consolidate their grip on power, they began to implement their racial vision known as apartheid, which essentially entailed racial segregation of public facilities, social events, affected kind of apportionment and allocation of land, and also kind of dictated economic opportunities and housing and economic, and employment opportunities just based on race. So becoming more involved, my grandfather, with a group of ex-servicemen, launched what was known as the Torch Commando, which was a protest movement, essentially to protest the disenfranchisement of minorities in South Africa. I think it's important just to say that even though that my grandfather wasn't subject in South Africa to segregation as a Jewish person, because actually Jews were considered to be white in South Africa, and therefore, kind of had all the privileges of white South Africans, he still felt really strongly that as Jews that they had an obligation to stand up against segregation. And he said, if we rationalize or condone discrimination against one group, we have compromised our principles and we are not true to our beliefs or our history. So he formed this group called the Torch Commando, which in its height rose to about 250,000 people, which was actually a very significant amount considering the relatively small population in South Africa, and particularly the small white population in South Africa. So, again, becoming more determined to get involved in politics, he decided to stand for the Johannesburg City Council in 1951. This was the first election of many that my grandmother ran as the election campaigner, my grandmother Annette. They met when she was a trade unionist, and she actually stopped working as a trade unionist because essentially the Nationalist Party and the police came looking for her because they didn't like the kind of activities that she was doing. And I think that really represents how, South Africa wasn't just becoming a country built on racial segregation. It was actually a full-on authoritarian state that was kind of able to happen because the National Party inherited such a strong state at the end of the Second World War, because there was so much centralization of power that was required because of the war effort. And so that really gave them an opportunity to kind of get a grip on power. But I say my grandmother ran all of his election campaigns, and I think if it wasn't for her kind of electoral prowess and particular skill as a campaigner and as an organizer, I'm not sure that my grandfather really would have had quite the success that he did. But he won a seat in the Johannesburg City Council in 1951, and essentially focused on various local issues like the sort of eviction of black people from local areas, but also tried to improve social conditions and economic conditions for the area. And then he stood for what was known as the Transvaal Provincial Council. The Transvaal was a region, essentially. So the Provincial Council was a bit like the Scottish Parliament, or let's say the Welsh Assembly. So he stood and won election there in 1958, and became the leader of the opposition there in 1963. And this is really the place that he started to kind of formalize his view for race relations reform in South Africa, and where he sort of began to get some prominence. But I think at this point it's also worth noting that, you know, obviously not all resistance to the National Party in the country was actually official and kind of on the books. Because white people, of course, were the only people who were really allowed to kind of engage in open politics. That meant that actually everyone else wasn't really, it didn't really have a formal channel to basically challenge the policies. And so there was quite a big division between him and, let's say, members of the African National Congress about the way that they actually approached change in South Africa. But my grandfather really felt that it was so important that change had to take place peacefully. And I think this partly reflects his childhood, when he actually saw a huge amount of fights in Nazi Germany or just before Nazi Germany, between the communists and the National Socialists. And I think he felt that if you legitimize violence through allowing it to change sort of a country's course and bring about change that way, then it really allows violence to come later, and even after the kind of revolutionary period. And that's something that he didn't want to do. My grandfather, when he was in politics, continued to work as a lawyer, because he really felt that it was important not to be dependent on politics for his income. And I think perhaps if you look at our own country today, I think that's probably quite a good principle to adhere to. But the most famous trial that he was involved in came in 1963. And it actually became one of the most famous trials in South Africa, but also I think probably the most famous trials across the world in the 20th century, known as the Rivonia trial, when Nelson Mandela and several others were arrested and charged with terrorism and advancing communism. And one of the people who was arrested was called Harold Walpe. And Harold escaped from prison, was able to do so. And his wife was the sister of another lawyer called Jimmy Kantor, who my grandfather knew quite well. And when Harold escaped, his sister, who Harold was married to, then was arrested herself and was being very, very badly abused in prison by the police, even though she had nothing to really do with it. So Jimmy came to my grandfather and said, you know, what do we do about this? My sister's being abused. I think we should go to the press. And my grandfather advised him not to do so, because he thought the police had already been humiliated by the escape of Harold Walpe. But he decided to go to the press anyway. And the result of that was that Jimmy Kantor, who was basically a apolitical sort of playboy type lawyer, was arrested himself and actually charged with the same crimes as Mandela. And so my grandfather was the person who represented Jimmy in the trial. And even though he was acquitted because he had nothing to do, you know, with any of the causes, you know, he spent a total of 9 months in prison, and I think, you know, including huge amounts of time in solitary isolation, and that really broke him as a person. And he had a very sad life afterwards. He moved out the country and eventually died of a heart attack a few years later. And my grandfather said that even though Jimmy Kantor was acquitted, he wasn't found guilty. The treatment that he had in prison really sentenced him to death. And so it was really a very sad case, but that's how my grandfather was involved in this very famous case. But again, it's where he saw Mandela, of course, who was sentenced to prison. In the 1970s, when apartheid really was at its height, my grandfather became a sort of national political figure. Known for his reformist views on race relations. However, the United Party, even though it was the official opposition party, really provided kind of tacit support to the apartheid racial policies in South Africa, because they thought that, well, certainly the leadership led by de Villiers Graaf felt that actually they needed to win those nationalists over if they were to win power. So my grandfather had these huge clashes with the party leadership, which really came to a head when my grandfather was able to replace someone called Maria Steyn in 1973 as the Transvaal provincial leader. And the following year, in 1974, my grandfather and a few of his other reformists were elected to Parliament. So they were really beginning to be a major centre of power in the party. And there was, as I say, this huge struggle over the kind of direction of the official opposition. In the same year, on January the 4th, 1974, my grandfather met with a black leader called Chief Gacha Buthelezi, who was the leader of the Zulus in South Africa and the chief minister of the KwaZulu province, which was basically a semi-sort of autonomous, independent homeland for Zulus. But he was the leader, the black leader with the most credibility in South Africa. And they basically sat down and decided how they were going to resolve South Africa's increasing strife and sort of racial problems. And they agreed something that later be known as the Mahlabatini Declaration of Faith, which essentially committed or called on all groups in South Africa to commit to some basic principles. Firstly, that political change in South Africa has to take place through the peaceful transition of power. So any armed struggle wasn't really appropriate. They called for a body involving all races to basically ensure that there was plenty of inputs from all groups in South Africa. It wasn't just one group asserting over another. It called for them to agree an end to discrimination for the whole country through the racial laws. But it also agreed that the economy must serve the interests of all South Africans. And this really reflected, I think, his experience as a child, going through destitution and poverty. And he said so many times that freedom is incomplete if it's exercised in poverty. And so I say he thought that economic opportunities had to match legal rights as well. And say all of those principles that I've listed, might seem obvious to us now, but actually they agreed them at a time when, the African National Congress and all the governing National Party were interested in any kind of peaceful solutions or dialogues. It was actually considered to be a major event when they signed it, and it received praise from major sort of progressive figures in and out of South Africa. But it caused a lot of problems within the party, and eventually, essentially, resulted in his expulsion from the party next year, or the following year in 1975. He was called to publicly reprimand one of his allies in Parliament, Dick Enthoven, but he refused to do so. And he made a grand speech in Parliament in which he said, "I make no secret of it. I am my brother's keeper. I will not be his executioner." And after that speech, him and Dick Enthoven and several other MPs were expelled, basically, who had all these anti-apartheid views. Should know that Dick Enthoven later went on to found a small chicken shop known as Nando's, and became a very successful businessman before his time in politics. But that night when they were expelled, they launched a new political party called the Reform Party. My grandfather was appointed the leader of the party. He was told at the time that he's the first Jew in Africa to lead a political party. I haven't been able to find anyone else before his time since then, so I think that's something quite interesting. But there was another progressive party in South African politics at the time called the Progressive Party, which some of you who know your South African politics from the 70s will know was the party of Helen Suzman, which was another a very brave and courageous Jewish woman who for many years actually stood alone in Parliament against the National Party as the sole representative of the Progressive Party. So they decided to merge their parties and form what became known as the Progressive Reform Party and eventually the Progressive Federal Party. Sorry, just to explain, the picture you're looking at now is from after the Mahlabatini Declaration, when all of his supporters gathered to basically support him after he had signed it and arrived in Johannesburg airport. So this was the Progressive Reform Party. And then in the it became the Progressive Federal Party after a few other organisations joined. And in the 1977 election, they managed to displace the United Party and became the official opposition. He was appointed Shadow Defence Minister and the Shadow Chancellor. And this was really the end of kind of no opposition towards the National Party's apartheid policies. They now had the prominence of the official opposition, and they could really campaign and scrutinise the government in the way that they couldn't before. This is them being the front bench being sworn in, and you can see my grandfather on the right. Just about make out his kippah, and he always wore it when he was being sworn into Parliament because he thought it was really important that as a Jew he was seen to be opposing apartheid. And unfortunately, there were people in the community who actually did support the National Party. And on the left-hand side, you can see Prime Minister P.W. Botha, who was presiding over it at the time. These are just some of the press clippings, really, from those years in which they were the official opposition. My grandfather used his portfolio, particularly his portfolio as Shadow Finance Minister, to scrutinise the government's economic policies, which were, I think, pretty disastrous when you look at them in terms of deflationary currencies, deflating their currencies, but also they simply refused to provide and incorporate black people and other minorities into the economy. So he used that portfolio to actually encourage much greater investment and inclusion of black people into the economy. So these are just some interesting headlines. Prime Minister P.W. Botha started this very slow movement towards reform in South Africa, including a new constitution in 1983, basically, that provided really not particularly significant reforms, but started some kind of process towards creating more channels for engagement, essentially. And during that parliamentary session, my grandfather proposed a Bill of Rights in South Africa that was very similar to what you see, let's say, in the United States, to protect against everyone in the country from discrimination, to ensure free speech, free press, essentially all the kind of major democratic liberties that you would expect. And the government rejected it on the basis that it supposedly would, quote, jeopardize the freedom of the white man, simply for calling for freedoms for everyone else. His party attempted to incorporate a Bill of Rights into the new constitution a further 5 times, but essentially it was blocked every single time by the National Party, putting the proposal at the bottom of the order paper. So this is just a cartoon from the Cape Times showing my grandfather on his crusade to get a Bill of Rights incorporated into the new constitution, which sadly, as we know, failed. But really, towards the mid-80s and towards the 90s, South Africa really became ungovernable. International sanctions were crippling the country. There was a huge amount of violence. There was actually a huge amount of increase in the black population, which I think some in the government really considered to be a tipping point in terms of being able to actually, dominate the country as a small minority. So eventually, a reformer called F.W. de Klerk came to power and did a huge number of things towards ending apartheid, including releasing Nelson Mandela. But in 1990, he asked my grandfather to come see him and asked that if he would help him essentially with a transition to democracy. And he asked him to be the new ambassador to the United States, which was the country's top diplomatic position, to basically help market the new South Africa and what it was about to become. And of course, as a long life opponent of apartheid and the National Party, my grandfather had to really consider this very strongly. So he went to see Nelson Mandela, to get some advice, and Mandela said that he thought it was a good idea to take up the position. He went to see Joe Slovo, who is the General Secretary of the Communist Party. He also said that he should take up the position. So he left with my grandmother for Washington in March 1991, and was was sworn in. This is George, or I should say his credentials were accepted by President George H.W. Bush at the time. And really worked on a whole number of things. Mainly the kind of remarketing of the new South Africa, trying to convince people that apartheid really was going to be dismantled. And one of the main things he did was try to dismantle the sanctions regime in South Africa. The Anti-Apartheid Act was a federal act which was removed, I think, within a few short months of my grandfather's arrival. But because of the United States political system, each of the 50 states had their own sanctions regime in place. So we actually had to travel literally all over the country to try to get each individual state legislatures to remove these sanctions. And one of the things that he did when he was there, was sort of as part of the negotiations for that, was agree to dismantle South Africa's nuclear weapons program. And this was actually the first time that any country in history, and the only country that's actually dismantled its nuclear weapons. When he was appointed, the Boston Herald said, when a man who has devoted most of his life to a struggle for the new South Africa tells you that apartheid is dead, he speaks with a moral authority that is different to a sail. This is the Salvation Army who they brought in to see the embassy, and the embassy in Washington really had become quite toxic, during the apartheid era, and viewed as a symbol of oppression in Washington. And so really, it was their role there to try to sort of reverse that and to renew it. And I would say that my grandmother played a really important role in that, because actually she was running all the kind of programs and events, and particularly the community outreach programs within the embassy. And really, because of her organization, was able to play such an important role in actually, very rapidly changing United States views towards South Africa, and convincing people that it really was, apartheid really was ending. This is April 1994. My grandfather unveiling the new South African flag to Bill Clinton and Al Gore. And this was done at the beginning of the election. And for me, this is really one of my favorite photos, because I think it, of his kind of political career in his life. I think, on the one hand, it represents the dawn of the new South Africa and the dawn of new relations. But I think kind of from a personal perspective, it represents the kind of power and contributions of refugees. I think, here you have a man who is unveiling the new flag of what was essentially his adopted country, to the country that actually rejected his family's plea for asylum. But I think, the flag also represents his own contribution in this context of what he actually could do for his adopted country. So I think, you can look at this picture in a whole different number of ways. So I think it's really an extraordinary picture for many reasons. And then, of course, Nelson Mandela's African National Congress won decisively in the 1994 election, which is the first ever fully democratic election held in South Africa. My grandfather really, after that point, after Mandela was sworn in, felt that actually his kind of crusade and everything he kind of fought for in his life had been achieved. Apartheid had been dismantled. Mandela, an old friend of his, was the new president. So he sent his resignation to Mandela, but Mandela insisted that he stayed on until Mandela's state visit to Washington in October that year, which he agreed to. So him and my grandmother organised the state visit, which was an extraordinary event. It was for the whole country, or for both countries. And here you can just see my grandfather getting out of Marine One, which is the official US presidential helicopter with Mandela. And I said it was a hugely successful event, and they were able to secure sort of a huge amount of investment in the country. And I think really for both my grandfather and my grandmother, this was kind of the culmination of everything they fought for. And And this was the speech that my grandfather gave, kind of toasting the new South Africa with Mandela in the embassy in Washington. And you can just see behind that one of my grandmother's paintings. And she was an accomplished artist throughout her whole life, and she had a lot of her art throughout the embassy. Which again, I think is quite an extraordinary photo to see. Just before I sort of finish off, I'll just say, after he came back from Washington, my grandfather went back into his legal practice and pretty much carried on working until the day he died. I think he was one of these people that just had an extraordinary intellect and basically just couldn't stop working, because that's just sort of the way that his mind worked. And so he worked until he died in February 2010 at the age of 85. But I think just to reflect on his life, I think for me, what could have been a very sad story of a kind of penniless refugee with not many opportunities, he actually turned into, a real life of not only success, but a life of contribution. And, I think there were so many opportunities in life when he could have basically just used the opportunities that he had for his own personal benefit. Not even just in terms of kind of a white person in a part of South Africa, but in so many other contexts as well. And I think really that kind of reflects actually how he viewed human beings in general and things that he felt that people deserved. And I think, things in South Africa didn't quite turn out exactly how we wanted. Of course, people have the legal rights, but actually, the country still is a very, very poor country in terms of how, most of its population lived. So I think he was quite frustrated at the end with, the fact that kind of political liberation didn't come hand in hand with economic liberation, but it's something he certainly, continued to talk about through kind of the rest of his life. So very happy to take any questions from any of you. So if anyone wants to also, again, contact separately, you can also contact me on Twitter or via email as well. But yeah, very happy to take any questions on any of that.
Thank you very much indeed, Adam. If you'd like to just stop the screen sharing.
Yes.
Please. Right. I'd invite questions. I have one up my sleeve and one other. So since I can actually see people, I don't think anybody's actually put any questions in the chat. Have they? Oh, Godfrey wants to. Hello, Godfrey.
Yes,
Would you like to unmute?
I have unmuted. Yes, it's a very simple question. When he changed his name from Heinz to Harry, why didn't he change his name from Schwarz to Black at the same time? Because Schwarz is as German as Heinz. It's
a brilliant question, and one that I wish that I had asked him, because it doesn't really make any logical sense. Because you're absolutely right. As soon as I saw Schwarz, it really wouldn't have made any difference that it was Harry. So I think it was sort of just a basic token gesture, and perhaps his commanding officer felt that it would have been too much to ask him to change his surname. But fortunately, he wasn't captured and didn't put that theory to the test.
Thank you.
I'd just say,
yes,
that Schwarz wasn't Schwarz in South Africa, it was Schwarz, and there were lots of Jews who were called Schwarz, and it was a perfectly acceptable name. Probably the stupidity of the Afrikaners, they didn't recognize that Schwarz and Schwarz were two different things. Well, the same thing, I mean. There were lots of Jews called Schwarz, and that was seen as, for some reason.
So there certainly were, but in terms of his safety, flying over Germany in the Second World War, I think it was still probably a bit of a risk, but you're absolutely right. I mean, it's still a very, very common surname in South Africa itself.
Right. A question's being fed to me. Whatever became of his brother?
So Kurt, hopefully is watching this with his wife, and he still lives in Essex with his wife. Became a very esteemed medical doctor and a professor. and say still lives not too far from me in London, which is really nice.
So
but he eventually left South Africa.
He left South Africa.
Yeah.
Right. One of our local members who wasn't able to join us and is looking forward to watching the recording has sent me an email with quite a long question. Apparently, there was a small paper which was sold on street corners. Seems to have been called Advance, or possibly The Guardian, and it was regularly banned because it supported the ANC, and it was edited by a courageous and brilliant Jewish barrister called Lionel Foreman. Have you come across him at all?
Oh, I've heard of his name. Unfortunately, I don't know too many details about him specifically, but I do know that the National Party was in a constant process of basically banning publications that it didn't feel were supportive, particularly in the 1970s. Shall I say, it wasn't just a system of segregation. It was a real authoritarian state that went hand in hand with segregation, because I think partly, you're really only able to push people around like that when you have brute force used against them. So I know there are a huge number of publications and individuals who were not able to continue publishing because of the very restrictive practices of the National Party.
Well, the note I've got here continues. Sadly, he died very young, being operated on by Christian Barnard.
Right.
In 1959. His wife was put under house arrest, and she actually lives not far from here in Sussex. But the important point is that apparently he gave Nelson Mandela his first job as a lawyer.
Right, okay. Understood, yeah. So, Mandela had a lot of very early engagement with Jews. And say, I certainly know the fact that he worked with Jews in his legal practice, which I think had a very big impact on Mandela's approach towards the Jewish community, because even though I'd say the Jewish community as a whole, a lot of people still supported the National Party, on an individual level, the Jewish community played such a disproportionate role. Both kind of from the extra kind of paramilitary organizations like the ANC and the Communist Party, but also inside Parliament, and of course in the press as well. Certainly know that Mandela had a lot of very, very good relations with Jews.
Well, apparently, Lionel Foreman once said to his wife, "One should watch this talented young man progress. He has a most charismatic personality and a way of attracting people." That's pretty good judgment, I think, at an early stage in his career. Absolutely.
And I think when my grandfather first knew Mandela, he knew he was involved in some political activities, but he actually found him to be quite studious. So, perhaps they just didn't happen to have those conversations. But I think you're right. Mandela had possessed very specific qualities from a very young age that really allowed him to endure everything that he did and eventually, overcome apartheid.
Right. Can't see anybody. Well, yeah. Did he visit Nelson Mandela when he was in prison on Robben Island?
So he tried to when he was in prison on Robben Island, but he was just constantly refused access to him. But when Mandela was moved to another prison, I think in 1988, called Victor Verster Prison, which was a much better prison with better facilities, better living conditions, Mandela was. My grandfather was given access to see Mandela. He sort of went to see him, I think, a few times to basically discuss the state of the country and the direction of things. but I think was very impressed when he saw him, that he was actually this man who was quite focused on the future of the country. You know, after being in prison for, you know, that stage 25 years, you know, you would expect to perhaps find a sort of broken individual, but actually he found someone who's determined to move towards the next stage of what they were going to do. So fortunately, he was able to get access to him. I think in 1988 was when he was moved.
To the prison on the mainland.
On the mainland, yes, that's right.
Yeah. I think we drove past that when we were in South Africa. Okay. Anybody else?
Yes.
Any questions? So, Lynette.
Yeah, I just want to say how proud you can be of your grandfather, really, because although the Jews in South Africa were very left-wing and were very involved in anti-apartheid, and many of them represented, just like the Jews in New York with this civil rights movements, by the time you're talking about, your grandfather could have been living like many of the Jews I knew in Houghton, with swimming pools and wonderful big grounds and having a really wonderful high life. The Jews were living really, really well. They weren't all fighting apartheid. He could have chosen a wonderful life for himself. So you really should be extremely proud of him for not having done so.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much, Lynette, for your comments. It's very, very kind of you to say. You certainly had a huge impact on my life in terms of things that I think it's important to do and to focus on in your life. So, you know, I'm really grateful tonight to have the opportunity to kind of share his story with the rest of you.
Oh, thank you very much. Just wonderful.
Last call for questions? No. Okay, well, Adam, a story which improves with the telling. I was very impressed when I heard you the first time, but I'm now even more impressed because I think you've condensed an enormous amount of activity by your grandfather into very neatly into 45, 50 minutes, which I think must have been actually quite difficult. As you said, even his wartime exploits could probably fill another lecture. We might take you up on that at some stage. I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of everybody who's attending this evening. I'd like to wish you success in getting a book published about your grandfather. I think that's one which the Jewish Historical Society would very much like to see published. But in the meantime, I think if you wanted to contribute something towards the JHSE in the form of perhaps a taster for the book, I'd certainly be prepared to see if we can get that onto our website, because I think this is a story which deserves the widest possible audience. So thank you once again.